This morning we're going to look again at our continuous in the parables of Jesus. Today we're in Luke 22, 1 through 14, the parable of the wedding feast. For those of you that have the blue Bible, if you don't have a Bible, there's the blue Bibles in the corner. That's on page 983, Matthew 22, 1 through 14. We continue in our study. Last week we studied Matthew 20, the laborers in the vineyard and how they were rewarded. In chapter 21, we see the account of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, his cleansing of the temple by the overturning the tables of the money changers, and then he is challenged by the chief priests and the elders, and they asked him, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" He rebukes them, tells two more parables, the parable of the two sons and the parable of the tenants. And at the end of chapter 21, we see these words. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because the crowds held him to be a prophet. As we start chapter 22, we see Jesus is at the temple. We know there are crowds there. We know there are people that perceive him to be a prophet. And the chief priests and the Pharisees are in attendance, and they don't want anything to do with it. Let's read that passage in Matthew 22, 1 through 14. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. And he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their cities. And he said to his servants, 'The wedding feast is ready, but those invited are not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads, invite to the wedding feast as many as you find.' And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all that they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?' And the man was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, cast him into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Would you pray with me again? Father, thanks again for this morning, for the privilege of being here, privilege of worship, of studying your word together. We know you spoke in parables, and it said when the disciples asked, you said you spoke both to conceal and to reveal your truth. Just pray that for each of us here this morning, this would be a time of seeing clearly your truth that you expressed in the story in this parable. Bless our time. Maybe you be glorified by our meeting here this morning. Thank you so much. In Jesus' name, amen. Parables, an earthly story to explain a heavenly truth. Some of the parables aren't nearly as clear as the parable of the wedding feast. This parable is very clear about who the king is, who the son is, and who the guests are. Let's look at it. Verses 1 and 2, those first two verses. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son." Isn't it true that all weddings are about the bride? No, seriously. The groom is like an extra. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you have experienced that. Many times the groom, he's like an extra. He's told, go stand up there. When the bride comes up the aisle, smile. When she stops, take 3 steps forward. Give her dad a hug, even though the two of you don't like each other. Give him a hug, because there's cameras. And then take her arm and turn and face the pastor doing the ceremony. It's all about the bride. The last wedding I attended was to start at exactly 3 o'clock. The time came and went and nothing happened. I'm looking at my watch. 15 minutes passed. All I'm thinking about, of course, is lunch. So I'm like, we're already late. I'm hungry. I drove a long ways. What's going on here? But when the bride was ready, then the groomsmen appeared and the wedding began. It's all about the bride. This wedding feast is different. There's no bride mentioned. This is a wedding feast for the Son. Clearly, this is God preparing a feast for His Son, Jesus. And we know the rest of the story from later on, that the bride of Christ is the church. It's people who put their faith and trust and hope in Jesus and His finished work on the cross. That's the bride being prepared for Christ. And verse 3. And He sent His servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. You notice how those words are. He sent His servants to call those who were invited. See, they've already been given the save the date thing. You all got those, right? I got one recently. Came in the mail. I didn't really look at the names. I just pulled the thing out of the envelope real quick, and I saw this picture of this lovely young couple. And it was, who in the world is that? So I had to go back and look on the envelope. Oh, this is a long-lost nephew on Marla's side that I haven't seen for 20 years. But this is the save the date for a wedding out in North Dakota in July, and I'm already thinking, oh man, how am I going to come up with excuses not to go to that one? But if you got to save the date from the king, which these people had gotten, because it says they went to call those who had been invited. You'd gotten a save the date from the king. It wasn't a big deal that I got a save the date from my long-lost nephew in North Dakota. It was a big deal if you got a save the date from the king. You were going to go to that event in that culture in that time. That was a big deal. I don't know what to compare it to. The one guy that was stretching to find a wedding, the feast that you would have went all the way back to the last great big wedding internationally was when Princess Di married Charles, long time ago. If you'd have gotten that invite, you'd have went, no matter what. And if you got an invite from the king, it was that big. You were going to go. The save the date was get ready for a big feast is coming, and the second was it's ready now. To those listening that day, those who were invited, they had the save the date. That save the date in the parable is the date that started in the Garden of Eden when the promise was made that her offspring will bear a son and he will bruise the head of the serpent. And then all of the Old Testament points ahead to the wedding feast that the Father is preparing for His Son. It all points ahead to that coming time when the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords would come. The 300 plus prophecies in the Old Testament should have had all of them looking for and seeing Jesus for who He was. Instead, we see at the end of verse 3, but they would not come. The unique element of this parable is that it's not that they could not come, it's rather that they would not come. Verse 4. Again, he sent other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen, my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. A picture of God's heart and how he longs for the presence of his people. Even though they've turned him down, he says, no, send somebody else. Please come. He goes into great detail of how lavish the feast is. We kind of breeze right over that. My oxen and my fat calves have been prepared. Everything is ready. And that day it was very rare indeed for anyone to have a steak, to dine on beef. You had to be in the incredibly wealthy class of people to be a part of that. But he says, this is what I prepared for you. It's the best ever. Come to this feast. Then in verse 5, we see their reaction to those. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business. The people that look carefully at the language say that those are very possessive terms. It's his own farm, his own business. In that day when there was kings, everything really at the end of the day was belonged to the king. He could conscript anything he wanted. He was the king. He owned it all. So for these people to arrogantly say, I'm going to my own farm or my own business, it's an additional slap in the face to the king. The ultimate insult to the king is to say, my stuff is more important than your banquet. Verses 6 and 7. After 5, when they paid no attention, went to the farm and the business. And then verse 6, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their cities. Finally, seizing the servants who bore the gracious invite of the king, treated them shamefully, killed them. If the invited guests felt that way towards the servant, they obviously felt that way towards the king who had sent them. And they would have seized, mistreated, and killed him if they could have. In other words, they would not come because they actually despised the king. Those of Christ's day bitterly resented his portrait of them in the parables, but that is precisely the way those religious leaders thought and acted. In the next chapter, in chapter 23, Jesus pronounces woes upon these same people, saying, woe to you, teachers of the law, and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our forefathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers. I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. It's Matthew 23, 29 through 37. We know that at the last, those rebellious subjects of the King of heaven even killed Christ. As Stephen later put it, was there ever a prophet your fathers did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You who have received the law that was put into effect through angels, but you have not obeyed it. That's Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Today, we are not so inclined to kill the prophets. But if we are honest, we will admit that the same spirit is present in our culture today. Finally, in verse 7, the king becomes very angry. He's had enough. Verse 7, the king was angry. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. The king was angry, sent his troops, destroyed and burned the city, an extreme punishment reserved for serious treason and revolt against the king. This is possibly an allusion to the forthcoming destruction of Jerusalem. It's about 40 years into the future that the Roman army comes in and absolutely destroys and burns Jerusalem to the ground. Then in verse 8, we see a switch. The first 7 verses are about those who were originally called, and that's obviously a reference to his chosen people, Israel. And then in verse 8, then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. We'll read 8, 9, and 10. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. And those servants went out onto the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. Go to the main roads. Invite as many as you find. Notice the term, the main roads. Who are you going to find on the main roads? Israel at that time in history, at that place in the world, it was a main road. It was a connection hub between Africa and Europe, between Europe and Asia. If you were traveling on the main roads, you weren't from there. You were going through. You're either going to Europe, you're going to Asia, you're going to Africa, you're going to Egypt. That's the significance of the main roads. It's go out and find everybody. Every nation, every tribe, every tongue, it's the people going through. If you went to Monty and you're going the main roads, you'd set up a roadblock on 212, 29, and 7, and then you'd get the people going through. If you just wanted the locals, you'd just go up by the school or down to Senex and get the locals. But this is a sign it's for everybody. Go get everybody you can find, and then he adds that to them. He says, both good and bad. Don't discriminate. Don't worry about who you're getting, who's coming. Bring everybody. I was talking to a person this week. I mentioned they wanted me to do something on Sunday, and I said, I can't. I got to go preach. I got to preach on the wedding feast. And the person I was talking to said, I know people who don't think they're good enough to come. I said, you need to read the story of the wedding feast. Jesus said, go and find everybody, good and bad. Bring them to the feast. Let them decide if they want to partake. The servants are not to distinguish. They're told to invite good and bad alike. And at the end of verse 10, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. That would have been an incredible offer. Here you are traveling through on the main road. You're not from there. And the servant of the king approaches you and says, come, there's a banquet. Everything's ready. All we want you to do is come and eat and partake of the best banquet you've ever seen. And it would have been. There's steak, there's roast, there's all the trimmings. Please come. It's ready. It says the wedding hall was filled. Now we get to verse 11. But when the king, there's always the but, right? But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who had on no wedding garment. Going back to Old Testament times, we see it was common for the king, when holding a feast, to provide garments for the guests so they would be properly attired to be in the king's palace. It was something you'd wear over the clothes you had already, most likely a linen garment, something to wear so you would be properly attired in the king's presence. But when the king came and looked at the guest, he saw a man who had not put on the wedding garment. The phrase there, to look at the guest, is a phrase that indicates that he looked very carefully, or when the king came in, he examined the guests. Hey, notice this guy doesn't have a wedding garment on. And he said to him in verse 12, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And the man was speechless. That detail, the man was speechless. That's the same thought that Paul expresses in Romans 3:19 when he says, "Every mouth will be silenced and the whole world will be held accountable to God." During the long years of his ministry, Donald Gray Barnhouse developed a way of presenting the gospel that used that text. When he was speaking to a person who was not sure he was a Christian, Barnhouse would ask, "Suppose you would die tonight and appear before God in heaven, and he should ask, 'What right do you have to come into my heaven?' What would you say?" Barnhouse had learned from his experience that there were only 3 possible answers that he would ever hear or that a person might give. Many would cite their good work, saying, "Well, I'd say I've done the best I can. I've never done anything particularly bad." That is an appeal to one's record, but as Barnhouse points out, our record of sin, and thus no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law, is our record that got us into trouble in the first place. A second group of people would respond as a woman did when Barnhouse once met on a cruise ship crossing the Atlantic. He asked, "If God demanded of you, what right do you have to come into my heaven, what would you say?" She responded, "I wouldn't have a thing to say." In other words, she would be speechless. Her mouth would be silenced and she would be held accountable to God. Jesus said that will be the case of all when God actually does ask that question. In this life, we may get by with the illusion that our record is pretty good and that God will be satisfied with it. But in that day, when we see God in his glory and in his holiness and understand what true righteousness, true holiness is, our folly will be apparent to ourselves as well as all other beings in the universe, and we will be reduced to silence if we are not clothed with the wedding garment of our Lord's own righteousness. This is the third and only acceptable answer, of course. What right do you have to come to my heaven? And our answer would be none at all, as far as I myself am concerned. But Jesus died for my sins and has given me covering of his own righteousness, in which alone I dare to stand before you. I come at your invitation, and in that clothing that you provided, the clothing of Jesus' righteousness. Will God reject such a one? He will not. For it is such a person he has bid to come to him. What is the wedding garment? It is the righteousness of Christ, provided freely to all who repent of sin, put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. Christianity isn't something that we add to our lives. We don't come to the wedding feast asking for a to-go box, saying, "I'm really busy, just put mine in the to-go box. I'll take it with me. I got stuff to do." Christianity is an explosion of grace and love that consumes our life. Not something that we do, but something that is done to us when we put on the robe of righteousness that the King so freely provides. And when it goes to work, it changes everything. Because of what he's done for us, we respond with, you can have it. You can have it all. All of me, my hopes, my dreams, my anxieties, my successes, my failures, my faith, my lack of faith, my curiosity, my future. It's all yours. In verse 13. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot, cast him into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You know, during his teaching ministry, Jesus said some of the sweetest, kindest, warmest things ever. Those passages in John where he talks about, I am the good shepherd, my sheep hear my voice, they follow me, and all of those just warm, tender passages. And then there's ones like this. Bind him hand and foot and cast him into outer darkness. There's a real tension in a statement like that. On the one hand, it can be terrifying. And on the other hand, it can be comforting. Terrifying if you read this and realize that's me. I'm the person who would have nothing to say to the king. I would be speechless before him. Change that today. Put your faith in the finished work of Jesus. Put on his robe of righteousness so that you can be confident and assured when you stand before God. It can be comforting for the one who realizes that should be me. I should have been cast into outer darkness. That would be the just penalty for my sin. But God, at just the right time, sent Jesus on a rescue mission for me, to rescue me from a sin nature and a death penalty that I could not pay. And he paid my penalty and clothed me in his robe of righteousness so I can have confidence and assurance. There's one more verse, but before we go to it, just wanted to go back to that one verse, that one where he tells the servants to go to the main roads and call them in. It was only a couple months later, after this time, that Jesus makes another one of those go statements. It's after the resurrection, after he's met with the disciples several times, and he meets them on the mountaintop. Remember, he says, go to a mountain that I've told you, and they meet there, and he says to them, you are my disciples. Go to the uttermost parts of the earth and make disciples. Very similar to this statement. Only here it was his servants in the parable. And now it's us. It's people who have been saved, people who have been rescued. He's saying you've been rescued. And once you are rescued, you become a part of Team Rescue. You go find someone else to share with them the news of a glorious feast. Glorious treasure. No greater treasure in all of life than to know Jesus. And so if we are going to be the wellspring that Jason talks about, it's a good term. We're going to be people who are going to be inviting. We're going to be excited about the banquet that is prepared and inviting people to come and experience the reality of Jesus. The last verse in the parable verse 14. For many are called, but few are chosen. The statement about the called and the chosen, a statement that's been debated throughout much of church history. Books have been written about it. I was listening to various teachers on the called and the chosen to get a handle on how this fits into the parable. When I was doing that, I was trying to figure out how to explain this, how to fit this into the parable. And I was listening to guys I thought could explain it well. And then a name came up. It was the name of R.C. Sproul. Sproul was a pastor and a theologian, a deep biblical teacher in the Reformed tradition. I knew he'd written books on this. And it came up, there was this little video clip, it was going to be R.C. Sproul talking about how to know if you're chosen. And I thought first, I'm not going to watch that. I'm going to get all mixed up. It's going to be just heavy-duty theology. Sproul was in the last days of his life. He died in 2017, but this was a conference where they had great theological speakers, and at the end, everybody get on stage in a chair, and they'd have questions and answers. And so these guys got up there, and they had their chairs lined up, and they were ready for the first question. And the question came, how do you know if you're chosen? And Sproul grabbed his mic and held it up. That's a signal to the other guys that I got this. And I thought, oh boy, we're going to get some heavy-duty stuff here. And he chatted a little bit, and he said, there is a test. You can know if you're chosen. The test is, do you love Jesus? He said, not that you love him completely, or that you love him as much as you could or should, but do you love him? See, at the end of life, for him, that was the last time he was going to be, and then it wasn't about great and deep theology, it was about the simple message of the gospel. Do you love Jesus? And in our story today, in the parable of the wedding feast, if you love Jesus, if you responded to his call, put your faith and trust in what finished work of the cross, what he did for you, then you're chosen to stay at the feast, to stay in the kingdom. That's what it means for the parable. That's what it means for life. It's about responding to that invitation that Jesus and Jesus alone could give. Remember, he says, there is no other name under heaven by where you can be saved but Jesus Christ. It's because there's no other sacrifice that is good enough, that is big enough, that is worthy enough to take away the penalty of sin and present you to a holy God with the righteous garments of Christ. It should give us excitement for life. To be able to say that we love Jesus with all of our heart, our soul, and mind, and strength.